up the bank, and whaley whaley down the brae, and whaley whaley yon burnside, where I and my love want to gae. I leaned my back until an ache, thinking it was a trusty tree, but first it bent and syne it brak, say my true love did lie to me.
Hey everybody, welcome to A Maker's Pilgrimage. I'm Aidan, the knitting monk, and I'm coming to you from Holy Cross Monastery in New York's Hudson Valley, where I'm a brother. You can find me on social media as Knitting Monk, and I'm mostly on Instagram and Ravelry with that name. I want to welcome back all of you who have been watching the podcast for a while. Your support really means a lot to me. And I want to welcome all of the new subscribers and viewers, of whom there are many. Since my interviews with Christy Glass and with the Helen and Caroline of the Love to Sew podcast came out in the last month, I've had right around 600 new subscribers to the podcast. So to all of you who are new, welcome. Glad to have you joining us as well. You can find all of the show notes and links to projects and all of that kind of thing over on the Ravelry group for the podcast. And I will include the link to the Ravelry group in the YouTube notes down below here. And there's also forums over there for conversation and exchanging yarn and other knitting-related, fabric-related kind of things. So be sure to check it out. This podcast, I'm coming to you without a super formulated plan, just like the last time. But it's been a couple of weeks and there are a lot of new subscribers, and so I wanted to just dive in. I'm just coming off of the Maker's Pilgrimage retreat that I hosted here at the monastery. We finished up yesterday morning. Yesterday was Friday, April 6th. And it was just wonderful. It really, really was wonderful. A lot of people that I didn't know and a lot of people I did know came on the retreat, including at least one person who found me through this podcast. So it was great to put some faces with names and all of that. It was such a funny thing that, I had started out, I had come up with the idea for that retreat maybe 6 months ago. And I thought I would probably get about 4 or 5 people who signed up for it because it's a new program. We don't run a lot of craft kind of things here at the monastery. It's a weird time. It was right after Easter. It was a Wednesday to Friday. I mean, there was just all this kind of stuff that led me to think that it would probably be a really small retreat. And I was okay with that because I thought, well, I'll just try out all this new material. It's a new program for me too, so I'll try out this new material on a small group. But we had somewhere around 16 people, which for us here at the monastery is a pretty big group. So I ran with it. That was great. And the folks who came really contributed an amazing amount of wisdom and knowledge and enthusiasm about the task of craft and how it influences and impacts our lives. So I thought I would start today by just giving you a brief rundown of that retreat. It's a lot of the themes that I've talked about here on the podcast before and may develop more at some other times. And then want to talk to you about a lot of works in progress, like a lot, for me anyway, a lot. So Without further ado, this is the breakdown of the retreat. We really used our own lives as the material for the retreat, and we started with introducing our craft autobiography. So I asked the group, what do you make and why do you make it? And then we sort of began to form community by telling our own stories and investigating a little more closely our craft and what relationship it has to the rest of our lives. And then our first session on Thursday was called Making as Power. And so we talked about the religious or theological or spiritual idea of incarnation, of being the human being this meeting place between matter and spirit, flesh and word, kind of the uniting of heaven and earth in some sense. And then asked the question, what happens to this meeting between flesh and spirit when we are no longer embodied, and when our embodiment is threatened by the ways that we use technology. And so for that, I really was drawing a lot on Alexander Langland's book, which I know is getting a lot of play on various podcasts, Creft, C-R-A-E-F-T, and I did a little bit of a review of it a couple of episodes ago, but we talked about what he really gets into is he talks about an illiteracy of power. So he describes what he calls Creft as not just the making of things, but the whole knowledge, the whole sense of the human self as a powerful being in the world, and the knowledge base to take raw materials in the environment and turn them into things that are useful for humankind and for the rest of the creation. And that we're in danger of losing that knowledge when what we do is we look at screens and we push buttons, and our lives are not really defined by our physicality anymore and our material needs. And so we talked some about what spiritual impact does that have on us. Because Langlands makes the point that it's in our human nature to be makers of things. And so when we stop making things, we really lose something of what it means to be human. And so we talked about how we can recover that sense of ourselves as powerful through the making that we do. Then the next session was called Making as Community. And we really looked at humility in the same way that we looked at humility on this podcast several episodes ago. And and it's so funny because of all the episodes I have recorded, that's the one that has gotten the least views on it. And what that tells me is that humility is not a really popular concept, Slow knitting, and it's like skyrocketing. Everybody wants to watch the slow knitting episode, but talking about humility, which is really talking about self-knowledge and being in touch with the deepest levels of who I am, and it's not a very popular topic. But nonetheless, we had a whole session on humility and using craft as a way to build community and build relationships between us and ourselves, us and other people, between us and the material world, and really how to get into that kind of deep spiritual level where we realize that the parts of ourselves that we least want to accept and acknowledge, those are actually the places we need to go because that's the doorway to transformation. And we talked about how craft can bring us into relationship with what we might see as our limitations, the parts of ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge or that we're ashamed of, but that actually moving into those places allows for transformation and healing to take place. And then helps us to be more present and available to others to help in their healing and their transformation. And then the last session that we had, we talked about making as contemplation. And we talked about how over time our making becomes more simple. It becomes more about process and less about product. It becomes easier and gentler, partly because we've developed skills, but also partly because our relationship to what we make changes, and that changes us as well. And we talked about that kind of contemplative dimension of craft, which is about being over doing, is about presence over performance, is about kind of stepping out of the way so that creativity and spirit can flow through us, rather than forcing something to happen. I mean, we all know what it's like to be in the zone, you know? So we talked about that as a platform then to being available more fully in the rest of our relationships in our lives, and just how powerful that can be. So it was a real privilege for me to get to know and to share these reflections with other people in a more intimate and interactive setting than talking to my iPad and publishing it on YouTube. But also to be able to really spend some time really like meditating on these themes that I've been developing in this podcast and through my reading and all of that kind of thing. And really getting to put those thoughts together and try them out and see how they resonate with the experience that other people have. So it was a really, really beautiful, beautiful retreat. I'm definitely going to run it again, so you'll hear more about it when I've scheduled another one, and I hope you're able to come because we had a really great time. And just a word about retreats and all that kind of thing. We have a really brilliant crocheter who lives in New Jersey, who's staying with us right now, and he was telling me about the women at the local yarn shop near where he lives in New Jersey, and they watch the podcast here. So hey ladies, Jacob's friends, I can't remember where exactly the yarn shop is, but he was saying that they love the podcast, and he was encouraging them to come up here on retreat, and they were saying, oh no, we couldn't do that, we're not Christian. And so I just want to say, I know I've said it before and I'll reiterate it again, here at the monastery we welcome people of any religious background or no religious background at all, and all of you, every single person who watches this podcast is more than welcome to come and stay with us. You're not required to go to church. We don't take attendance at anything. Unless you initiate the conversation, somebody's not going to sit down and talk to you about Jesus, and nobody's here to convert you. Really, our mission in the guest house is to provide space for people to come, to rest, to renew themselves, to be in a beautiful natural environment with the Hudson River flowing right outside our door. So any of you are more than welcome to come on retreat at any time, and you can make the retreat whatever you want to make it into. So please don't let religious affiliation or no religious affiliation stop you if you need some time and space to rejuvenate. And whether you do that here with us or you do that by going camping or going to the beach or whatever it is that you do, I really hope you're able to get time and space to recharge and to have some silence and some solitude, because my gosh, we need that in our world. We really don't get enough of that. So that's the retreat aspect. I have a few more things to share with you today. Um, in reflecting on where I am in my making life, I really find myself at where we ended the retreat, which is in contemplation, and I'm looking more and more at my creative life as one unified whole. Um, there are all kinds of different creative activities I'm engaged in. I knit, I sew, I write, I garden, um, and those are just the activities that produce something. But I think of my reading as part of my creative life. I think of my prayer as part of my creative life. I think of my walks in nature as part of my creative life. Um, and so I guess I'm just more and more trying to look at the whole of my creative life as my making instead of looking at the individual kind of compartmentalized aspects of that life. Um, and I really had started to feel like things are a little too cluttered, and a little out of balance. And I think I mentioned this in the last episode too, like when I was in the muck. And I'm out of the muck now. Praise, I love being out of the muck. Hallelujah. Um, but, um, but, to really be looking at kind of decluttering a little bit. So I have more works in progress going right now than I have ever had. I've tended to be a kind of monogamous knitter and sewist, but I've got a lot that's kind of hanging around, and I'm going to walk you through just a handful of those things and decisions I'm making. The first decision being that I'm not going to start a new project until I have finished the projects that I have. I just want to share a few of those projects with you and what I might do with them. I think you remember from a few episodes ago this veil mount pullover that I was working on. This is a women's pattern for Brooklyn tweed, and I had decided to adapt it to a sport weight yarn and to my body, and I was going to make it into a men's sweater. Well, this is one ball of yarn. I think it's about 7 inches of the pullover. I did just through one ball of yarn. I'm using Harrisville Harrisville Design. It's their cashmere blend. It's 50% cashmere, 50% fine wool, and it's undyed, and it's so soft and beautiful. But the thing is, I bought this yarn on eBay, a batch of 9 skeins, and they're 50-gram skeins. And I realized, doing some rough calculations, if this is one ball of yarn, based on my total measurements, I'm going to need 10 balls of yarn at the minimum. I would need 11 to feel comfortable to have enough to finish the sweater like this. But here's the thing. This yarn is discontinued, so I can't buy more of it. And there is no one on Ravelry who has this color in this yarn listed in their stash. And I can't find it on eBay, and I can't find it on the Harrisville Design site or anywhere else for that matter. Because I sort of have a feeling it's been discontinued for years now. So I'm going to just put this away until I've finished my other projects I'm working on, but I'm leaning towards ripping this out and using the yarn for something else. So that's one possible solution to works in progress, is just to rip them out. And then they're not works in progress anymore. So that's what I may end up doing with this one. That's what I'm leaning towards. But it's I love the yarn, I love the pattern. But you know what? If I rip it out, then I have lovely yarn for something else. And I can use other yarn for that project. I also, as some of you will know from my Instagram account, I started impulsively because I got obsessed with it, looking at Phoebe.ll, I think is her name on Instagram, was making the Peaks pullover, which is a colorwork pullover by Jared Flood, also for Brooklyn Tweed, because that's basically everything I make now. Um, and she had done this beautiful black and natural light gray version of this pullover, and it was so beautiful. And I really, really got captivated with it, and I thought, I want to make that. So the problem is, it is you use two different colors, probably a dark color and a light color. All of the samples and the versions people have knit are in natural shades for the most part. And so I knew I didn't have enough of one contrast color, and I did not want to buy yarn because I have plenty of yarn. So I'm trying not to buy anything new until I've used up what I have. So I decided that I would go for an ombre effect, and I would go from dark yarn on the bottom, because I have these several different shades of undyed yarn. So I thought I would use that for the contrast and go from dark on the bottom to light in the middle, and then the light in the middle to the dark on top again. So let me show you what I got. I have done all the way up to the underarm on it, and I'm working on my first sleeve right now. So you can see what I mean here. It's a little too big to get you the whole thing. But I started with right here on the bottom. This is a dark, I think it's a Rambouillet yarn from Holy Myrrh Bearers Monastery, and I had this left over from the contrast border I did on the winter honey shawl I made in January. So I've got that right there, and then I switched to the next lightest shade, which is, you can see right there, is a Shetland yarn from Wing and a Prayer Farm. It's this beautiful kind of gray-brown. And then I moved up to right here. Oh, and I had this Shetland left over from the traveling cable hand warmers that I knit up a few months ago. And then this yarn right here, the lightest color, is the leftovers from the migration cardigan, cabled cardigan that I knit recently, a light undyed gray merino from Beaver Slide Dry Goods. So I'm going to continue with this light, and then I'm going to switch back to the Shetland, and then I'm going to finish up at the top with the this Rambouillet here. So just a few things about this pattern, just to be totally transparent here. So the dark blue yarn you may recognize because this is the yarn from the Cabled Monster pullover. So you see, here's the thing. I drew two different names over the course of 2 months to give away that sweater, and neither person contacted me. And then I wanted to make this sweater, and I thought, well, I haven't heard back from either person whose name I drew. So I decided that I was just going to rip out the sweater and reuse the yarn. It's been long enough now that that doesn't feel painful to me. And it looks perfect with this pattern. I love that blue, that dark, dark blue there. So that's one, moment of transparency. The other is that, I'm not a big maker of colorwork projects, so this is my first, probably the biggest colorwork project I've done. I just blocked out this piece to find out how it was measuring up, and I realized that it's about 4 inches larger than I would normally make for myself. I normally make a 44-inch in circumference sweater for myself, which gives me about 4 inches of positive ease. so I can wear a shirt under it and, not feel like it's super tight and all that. This sweater at 48 inches would be um, quite relaxed on me. But I'm actually thinking that I'm not going to rip it out and I'm going to complete the sweater at that measurement. I really had to give it a good think, and I think I don't have anything that large in my wardrobe, and I'm wondering, now this is a bit of an experiment, but I'm wondering if this will fill that gap, because then I can wear extra layers underneath it in the middle of the winter when it's really cold, and maybe I want something with a little bit more of a slouchy, relaxed fit to it. Now, when I finish it, if I find that it really is just enormous and I hate wearing it, then I guess I'll be faced with the decision of either ripping the whole thing out or giving it away to somebody who it will fit. And I've thought about it long and hard, and I'm okay with that. I really am, because I love the design. I would love to have this for myself, but it's also just been really, really fun to knit. So in the vein of being more process than product oriented, I'm just going to keep going with it because I'm enjoying making it. And if I have to rip it out, then I rip it out. Or if I decide I don't want to rip it out and I want to give it away, that's okay too. The other thing I'm loving about this project is that it is entirely from waste yarn. It's from a sweater that I didn't want, so I ripped out the yarn from that, and then leftovers from other projects. And this is part of what I find so beautiful and creative about having an ecological mindset when it comes to making, is that the sweater was not designed to have an ombre effect. And if I were just looking at the pattern and buying yarn from scratch, I wouldn't have thought to do that. But if I'm looking at the resources I have and saying, what can I do with these, then I've come up with a new creative take on this pattern, and it's a creative take that I really like and I think is working really well. So that's how part of how being ecologically minded with the making can lead to some real creativity. So I got two more works in progress to share with you. Switching media now. I've been working on, you may remember, I can't remember if I showed this on the podcast or not, but I made my first quilt top way back in January. It is, see, I'm already showing mistakes on it. See, doesn't line up perfectly, but my very first quilt top. You can see all the various kind of squares there. And after I finished the top, I kind of ran out of steam on the project, and it's just been sitting there. And partly it was that I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it, because I had intended it to be large enough for a single bed. I have a twin bed, and I had intended to maybe put this on as my bedspread. But then once the sewing was done, I had miscalculated, and it was too short on the sides really to fit a single bed very well. And although I really love the color scheme, these foxes here, which are super cute, are not really my personal style, at least for a bedspread. I mean, I think they're adorable. They'd make a great lining for a bag. But for an adult man, I don't know, they don't really scream sophistication. Let me put it that way for my bedspread. So what I decided to do with this quilt is I definitely want to finish it. And my godson is turning 1 year old in June. So that's a couple of months from now. And I'm going to finish this quilt and send it to him for his birthday present. And I think it's a very sophisticated pattern for a 1-year-old. And so I think he and his parents will love it, and it's a lot of fun to be able to make something for him. And then I will get this quilt finished, and I will be able then to start another quilt, which is what I'm hoping my summer sewing will be. I think I may actually not do any more garment sewing this summer. I say that, maybe I will, but Jacqueline Salem released this beautiful hexagonal quilt pattern recently called Hex Appeal, and I love the name. And I've been collecting all of these blue and white scraps from shirts that people have been throwing away, and our old altar linens that have holes in places and that kind of thing. And so my plan is to make a blue and white hex appeal quilt for my room, for my bed. And that will be my summer sewing project, I hope. So stay tuned, because we'll see. But first, getting the works in progress off of the list is really a part of that. And that way, when I have cleared the decks a little bit, then I have more space to let something else emerge. Also, because it's gardening season, even though it keeps snowing here in April, but the daffodils are starting to bloom, the crocus are in full bloom, the tulips are coming up. It's about time to start the vegetable garden. So I know a lot of you have requested to have some gardening content on here, and so there will be once there's content to put. Right now it's just pictures of the bulbs that I've planted. And I love bulbs, so I plant a lot of them here. But I'll give you some more gardening content as that comes up. But that's another work in progress, the garden. So the last work in progress that I have to share with you is that I'm also nearing completion on is something that I haven't shared with any of you yet. And it's a piece of writing that I have been doing for the last couple of years. I've been working on a spiritual memoir, and I have picked it up and put it down and picked it up and put it down. I'm probably like 20 or 30 pages away from a complete draft at this point. I don't have a publisher for it. That has not been my intention. I would like to publish it, but I haven't been writing it looking ahead to that. With this one, I'll describe a little bit of the process to you. I had, when I was in seminary, this very intense spiritual experience in a shamanic breathwork workshop that I was in. And had a full-on 2-hour vision kind of thing in this breathwork program. And I wrote it down right afterwards, everything that had happened, and then have gone back to it many times. This is probably about 6 or 7 years ago that this happened. And at one point, right after I came to the monastery, I wrote a long poem of the experience. And I shared it with several of my close friends and brothers here at the monastery. And one of them said to me, "This is beautiful and really powerful, but it needs a commentary because it's hard to kind of dive into." So I started to think about what it would mean to write a commentary for that poem, and I realized the commentary really is my whole life, because what the experience in somewhat narrative form kind of revealed the arc of my life to me, both the past, but also it's been quite strange to see how things have come out of it in the present as well. So I just started writing, and I wrote fanatically for about 6 months and got a lot written down in that time. And it really, the process of writing was really instrumental in healing some aspects of my relationships, and also in revealing things that still needed healing work that I hadn't been aware of before. And I heard a writing teacher say once, if you write it, it will heal you. So that has been my experience so far in doing this writing. And I stopped writing it for about 6 months because I came to a place where I was just writing with kind of looking at like, oh, if I want to get this published, like I need to write X, Y, and Z. As if I knew anything about getting a book published. I mean, I've never gotten a book published. But I started writing it for publication instead of writing it as a spiritual practice for myself. So I stopped and I just put it down and I said, I'll come back to this at some point. So about 6 months afterwards, which was a couple months ago, I picked it up again, and I've been writing for about an hour every morning, editing, reading what I've already written, and I'm nearing the completion of a draft on it, and it feels really huge. I mean, it was kind of a humbling experience to read back over things that I had written and to find them moving, and to think, I know I wrote those words, but there was something else going on there. You know, it was me, but it was also like spirit moving through me, writing those words. You know, kind of like when you finish a sweater and for the first time and you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made that. I mean, I was present, like doing all the stitches the whole time, but at the end, when there's the whole final product, like I actually made that. That's incredible. So it's a little bit of that awesome experience, which I also get while gardening, and those tulips start to come up, and it's like just incredible. You know, I mean, I know I planted them, I put my hands in the dirt with them, but then they've actually emerged, and there's so much more than just the sum of my actions, you know? In the same way with knitting, and it's turning out to be the same thing with this writing process. So I haven't shared this piece with pretty much anybody. When I have a complete draft, I'm going to share it with some close friends whose opinions I really trust. But I did want to just read a little bit of it to you, and even as I say that, I'm feeling really anxious because this is not an aspect of my life that I share with very many people. So this is a bit of a coming out moment for me. So here we go. This is a little bit from the very beginning of the book. And the book, I should say, is called Wider Than Wide, subtitled A Meditation on Desire, because it's really, it really traces my whole life, traces the thread of desire through my whole life, and the ways that my desires and longings have shaped me and really have drawn me to the monastery and continued to shape me here in the monastery. So here we go. This is a little bit of it. I am, as we all are, driven by inner urges, cravings, longings. My first, perhaps most primal hunger was for escape. I felt a driving urge to leave that, like Jeremiah's fire in the bones, would not be denied. Even as a small child, I knew eventually I would cast myself to the wind. I was never entirely at home, especially in my own skin. Restlessness haunted me. It still does. There are nights I wake with a gasp, expelled from the humidity of dreams into the dark of consciousness. My body mourns its loss of freedom. I crave, and the craving hollows me. So much space, so much emptiness. One of the great fantasies I nurtured as a child was that my family was of ancient, aristocratic Southern stock, fallen on hard times. Somewhere in the misty past lay the ruins of our terra. No one ever said so explicitly. I formed the idea from a combination of stories of my grandmother's parents, who, until the Depression, had a farm and general store, and also from the grace and elegance that my grandmother both exuded and cultivated. She was the grand matriarch of our now humble family, and I was going to restore her to her throne. I don't blame my family for this fantasy, except for the degree to which they cultivated the impression of prosperity where none truly existed. My grandmother possessed a natural elegance and grace. She also took pains to copy the styles of Southern living. When I was a child, she and my grandfather lived in a two-story townhouse with parquet floors polished to a high shine. That house seemed to me one of the grand old homes on the squares of Savannah, complete with a huge southern magnolia in the back. The furniture that filled the capacious living room had proper names: Martha Washington chairs, a Japanese coffee table, Fudog lamps. I loved the way decorating terms sounded in my mouth as I copied my grandmother's speech. Valence, swag, credenza, recamier, chandelier. It was all so grand and refined. So was my grandmother. Every year she and my aunt shopped for new Easter hats. It mattered little that they were great bargain hunters and that the hats came from the Neiman Marcus outlet. They wore those hats with royal ease. They looked smart, as my grandmother would say. Mimi, as I called her, adored her full-length mink coat, too. It was an anniversary present from my grandfather. She pulled it on, reveling in its elegant weight, and when she stuck her hand into the pockets, she found a diamond ring. I loved this story. Mimi loved entertaining and did so frequently. Her dinner parties were always elegant, the dining table clothed with damask, candlelight winking in the crevices of Waterford crystal and silver flatware. There were 2 sets of bone china. I knew their names as well as I knew my own, Noritake and Haddon Hall. When I was a small boy, my grandmother taught me the proper way to set a table. She still had her home economics book from high school. Black and white photographs showed crisp white tablecloths and place settings with 8 different utensils, 3 plates, and 4 glasses. I spent hours studying these photographs and the descriptions of the various implements of fine dining, memorizing where to place the water glass relative to the wine glass, and delighting in the knowledge that fish is eaten with 2 forks and no knives. I will still unthinkingly turn a knife blade inward if it isn't already, more from muscle memory than thought. My greatest pleasure when staying with my grandparents was to set the table. Even for a regular weekday supper, I'd go out back of the kitchen and clip a few blossoms from the old magnolia tree to float in a bowl of water, careful not to touch the petals lest they bruise, as I'd been warned many times. Well into my teenage years, I insisted on using fine china for holiday meals, even though by that point there were at most 5 of us at the table, 2 still in their pajamas. My grandparents' table was the life of that house and the life of our family. Every celebration, large and small, revolved around that table. Until my grandparents retired, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter found the table stretched with 3 leaves and an overflow card table in the living room. Even so, we squeezed more chairs around that table than should rightly have fit. Everyone was welcome, and it often seemed as if everyone came and brought a guest too. All the strays, as we came to call them, who had nowhere else to go. The table extended into the neighborhood too. One Thanksgiving, my grandfather went to the service station to pick up something he'd forgotten to buy earlier at the grocery store. He met and started talking with a homeless man sitting outside the store. On his return home, he silently filled a paper plate with turkey, dressing, and the like, and covered it in foil. He went back to the station to make sure the homeless man had some of our dinner. Only after we'd eaten did he tell us where he'd gone. My grandparents' table taught me my earliest lessons about hospitality, radical welcome, and love. It was where my grandmother's unbounded lust for life showed to best advantage. It was also where I learned the art of storytelling and the family histories. There, our local branch of the communion of saints and sinners, the fellowship of ghosts and angels, had its regular meetings. The members of this communion had names as exotic and delicious as my grandparents' furniture. There was Ada Pearl, the patroness of vanity, my grandmother's mother. Her fear of aging led her into a heap of trouble, as when she once allowed her 2 young grandsons to convince her that icy hot would remove her wrinkles. They applied it liberally to her face, which seared hot and cold for hours afterward, but left her as wrinkled as she'd ever been. These same 3 figures originated the family custom of waving the middle finger of the right hand while saying in a cloying tone, "I love you." When my grandmother's cousins were about 10, they convinced Ada Pearl that the middle finger meant "I love you." After my grandmother came to pick the kids up, her mother came out into the street waving her middle finger over her head, hollering down the road, "I love you." Like a character in a Flannery O'Connor story, Ada Pearl's vanity had more serious consequences, too. Embarrassed by the fact that she was 5 years older than her husband, she reduced her age on all future legal documentation by 10 years. When she was elderly and needed to draw Social Security and Medicare, she had a deal of a time proving that she was old enough to qualify for it. Having been born in rural Alabama in 1899, she had no birth certificate. Her children had to dig up witnesses who could testify to her age. She finally did qualify, dignity bruised, but otherwise unharmed. The women in my family were great talkers, always telling stories, quick with words. I came to understand the value of a well-turned phrase or a colorful expression. My grandmother's Southern sayings, as we called them, enlivened discussion as she explained why taking Shank's mare meant you were walking someplace. There is in Southern culture a certain insistence upon politeness, even when based on a half-truth or a lie. I certainly imbibed this habit around my grandmother's table. There I learned to understand all the nuances of "bless his heart," which, depending on tone, could mean everything from "that man has had such a hard row to hoe" to "he doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground." The habit of telling half-truths and had more subtly harmful effects, too. I learned to conceal painful realities at that table. This ability proved useful in the high-anxiety world of the Ivy League, but it has had its disadvantages in my relationships. When at 30 years old I finally told my mother I'd felt suffocated as a child, she was taken completely unaware. We had never talked about it, and I had learned the art of falsification so well that although I had described this experience to friends and therapists for years, I had never let on to my mother. Better to maintain the appearance of the well-set table, each glass and knife in its place. I remember well my aunt's friend Sherry, so constant at our family celebrations that she was essentially an Owen. She wore these outlandish outfits that you only saw in places like Dallas. Hot pink suits with wide-brimmed hats. Her smile matched those hats, bright and gleaming, and she had this full-bodied, high-pitched cackle of a laugh that warmed the air around her. That laugh, those bright suits, and Sherry's cheerfulness belied a great deal of physical and emotional pain. Perhaps more than any other single image, it is the icon of Sherry laughing through her pain, her open mouth half smile, half grimace, that signifies my childhood. And there's a lot more, but I'm going to stop there for this little taste of yet another work in progress. Take a deep breath after that. And a little sip of tea. So there are more works in progress too. I have a couple of socks I'm working on and another sweater project as well. And I have a lot of books to read that I have on my to-read shelf. So that's all to say that I want to look at my whole life more and more as one unified whole. And the more deeply I engage with my creativity, the more I see that wholeness really is emerging. And it's a wholeness that develops over time, so it gets more whole over time. But I'm wanting to be really intentional about kind of sinking in to that wholeness. So that's what I have to share with you today. I hope that you are enjoying the start of spring, if it is spring where you are. I hope that you are finding ways to enter into greater wholeness in your own life. I hope that the work in progress that you are is continuing to unfold and to be knit and stitched together into a beautiful pattern. And I look forward to connecting with you more. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Some of you preface your comments or your emails or your messages by telling me you hope you're not bothering me. I can assure you, you are not bothering me. I love to hear from all of you. And I apologize that it sometimes takes me a while to respond. I'm juggling a whole bunch of different responsibilities, but it doesn't mean that I don't really appreciate hearing from you and getting your feedback and your suggestions. So please don't hesitate to reach out with anything, because I'll be more than glad to be in communication with you. And I just beg your patience for the times that it takes me a little while to respond. So thank you again for tuning in to this episode of A Maker's Pilgrimage. You can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Knitting Monk, and you can reach out to me in either of those locations. You can leave a comment here on YouTube, whatever works for you. So until we meet again, be well.